To create a cloner, click on a layer, and then click on one of the 3 green buttons on the MographAE panel. The grid button to duplicate the layers to a grid, the array button to a radial array, and the linear button to a line. All 3 cloners are controlled by the generated null objects, and you can transform the cloner by scaling, moving, or rotating it. Under Transform settings, each cloner has the option to unlink the rotation of the layers from the null object. You can also adjust base Z rotation, which will uniformly rotate each layer. Under Scatter settings, you can add random position to the layers and adjust the magnitude of the randomness using the point sliders as well as the random seed. Additionally, each cloner has a delay settings tab. If you check random delay and add a simple animation, the animation will occur at random times for the linked layers. However, this delay behaves a little bit differently for each cloner, so we'll go more in depth in a second. One thing to note about cloners is that the position of layers is determined by the layer's index. You can see this if you color one of the layers a different color, and then move it up and down in the layer stack. This also means that if you delete or duplicate layers linked to a cloner, they will automatically reposition themselves. Alright, we covered the shared properties of cloners. Let's take a look at each cloner individually. The grid cloner allows you to duplicate a layer along an X and Y axis. If you create a new grid cloner by selecting a single layer, it will duplicate this layer to a 3x3 grid. But if you create a new grid by selecting several pre-existing layers, it will organize these layers to a grid with appropriate dimensions. In the auto-generated MographAE effect on the null object, there are additional settings for the grid cloner. You can adjust the dimensions of the grid in the X and Y directions, as well as the pin X and pin Y options. Pin X determines the origin point of the grid on the X-axis, and pin Y determines the origin point on the Y-axis. If you select pin X to the left and pin Y to bottom, the grid will originate from the bottom left-hand corner. Under Transform settings, you can adjust the grid spacing with the X gap and Y gap sliders. By enabling delay in the delay settings tab, you can add delay to the transformations of the cloner. This delay only applies to ordinary transformations, such as scale, position, and rotation. It doesn't apply to the transform settings in the effect or the scatter settings. By default, the layers closest to the null animate before the layers furthest from the null. If you want to reverse this order, you can check reverse delay. Because the layers are delayed based on their distance from the origin null, changing pin X2 or pin Y2 will also change the start and end gradient of the delay. By default, the delay is set to distance from origin. This means that the further a layer is from the null, the more it will be delayed. But if you change the delay to distance along X-axis, the delay will only increase based on the layer's distance from the null in the X direction. The opposite is true for distance along Y-axis. By animating multiple properties, you can achieve an interesting staggered look that is difficult to get through normal methods. Okay, that's good enough for the grid. Let's look at the array. Overall, the array is similar to the grid, but instead of arranging objects into a grid, it arranges them into a radial array. You can create an array either by duplicating a single layer or selecting multiple layers. Rather than an x and y parameter, you can determine the shape of the array using the start angle and end angle parameters. And rather than x gap and y gap, we control the radius of the array under transform settings. One difference between the array and the grid is the delay settings tab. When we activate delay on the array, the layers will be delayed based on their index in the timeline. So the start of the array animates first, and then the end last. Also, the delay does not affect transform and scatter settings, just like with the grid. But delay does affect animations based on the start and end parameters. Alright, that's all for the array. Let's move on to the linear cloner. The linear cloner arranges objects into a line. You can create a linear cloner either by duplicating a single layer or selecting multiple layers. In the MographAE linear effect, we have a lot of parameters to determine the linear cloner's shape. There is position, which we can control with this point control. And there is rotation, which as we increase, you'll see the rotation gradually increases along the line. There is the strength property, which allows us to adjust the strength of the transformations. And there is a mode dropdown. By default, the mode is set to endpoint. This means that the set position and rotation signify the end goal of the layers. But if you switch mode to step, these parameters then signify the per step transformation of the layers. You may also note that the layer first in the timeline appears first in the line. If you want to reverse this order, you can check Reverse Layer Order. Finally, for our transformations, there is the spline property. By default, this spline is set to 2 linear keyframes from 0% to 100%. But if we add easing and adjust the value curve of this property, you'll see that the progression becomes modified. Just like the array, the delay is determined by the layer's index in the timeline. The delay does not affect anything in the transform settings or scatter settings, just like the other cloners. But it does affect animations on the strength, position, and Z rotation properties. Alright, that's enough for the linear cloner. Let's take a look at the effectors. The field allows you to influence layers using proximity. You can create a field by selecting layers, and then clicking the field button. By default, the field will affect the position of the layers using proximity. You can change the shape of this proximity effect with the outer radius and inner radius sliders, or by scaling the field's size. You can also transform it from a line to a circle using the shape dropdown. If we animate the position of the field, we can add a delay staggered effect to the linked layers using add random delay, which works similarly to the cloner's random delay. Also similar to the cloner, we have the option to add randomization to the influence of the field. Let's turn these off for now. By default, the field will move the layers 100 pixels in the X direction and 100 pixels in the Y direction. If you want to change this, you can change the influence slider on the transform position effect. And if you want to adjust the easing, you can open up the spline property in the graph editor, and just like with the linear cloner, we can change the fall off by adding easy ease, or creating another curve that fits our needs. By default, field acts on position, but you can select custom properties if you want. Let's search for rotation, position, size, and color in the layers that we have selected. Great, we found the properties, but let's not rush to manually select them across all layers. Instead, let's take these steps. First, select the properties that we want. Second, ensure that we've selected all the layers that have the same properties in them, and then run the select same properties function. All these properties will be selected in all the layers we have selected. Now we can create a field. Now we have control sliders for every single property on our field, and we can see their name as well as their parent. And just with position property, we can modify their values. And also adjust the easings. Let's say you want to link another property to the pre-existing field. Let's follow these steps. Search for the value in the layers, and use the select same property to select the property in all layers. Next, let's click the link button rather than the field button in order to link the value to the controller that's specified in the drop-down to the right. In this case, field 1. The field can also be applied multiple times to the same layer. To do this, let's first create a field, and then create a field on the same layers that this field is linked to. Let's not rush to manually select all linked layers for this controller. Instead, let's select the controller alone, and then use the select function. All linked layers are now selected. We can now add a new field this way. And their effects compound in a simple and predictable pattern that can be used to create more complex results. Okay, that's good for the field. Let's take a look at the other effectors. Overall, the step function works similarly to the field. Its main function is to apply an effect that increases based on a layer's index in the timeline. Like the field, by default the step acts upon position, but you can add any property, even sliders and color values to the step controller, and effects will be created so that you can manage these linked properties. If we take a look at the main parameters in the controller's effect, you will see many similarities to the linear cloner. For instance, we have strength, which just like in the linear cloner, modifies the strength of the whole effector. We have spline, which can be used to add easing to the step effect. We have mode and reverse layer order, which also work the same as in the linear cloner. And under delay settings, the controls closely resemble that of the linear cloner as well. If we turn on delay for an animation, it will delay the animation of the strength property only, based on max delay. Reverse delay reverses the order of the delay's ramp up. So the delay in this section follows the same logic as the linear cloner. There is also a random influence setting, which works the same as the random influence setting in the field. One difference between the linear cloner and the step effector is that the step effector has a special property called layers per step. And one difference between the field and the step effector is that on linked property effects, we have a base offset property. This property allows you to increase flatly values across layers, which doesn't change based on the layer's index in the timeline. Alright, that's good for the step effector. Let's look at the target effector. The target function operates on proximity like the field, but it's limited to only two effects. These are look at and repel. You can toggle either effect on or off with the checkboxes. When it comes to look at, we have two settings. Rotation correction, which adds extra rotation to all linked layers, and strength, which controls the influence of the look at effect. Repel has four settings. Spline, which allows us to remap the easing of the repel effect. Outer and inner radius, which determines how far from the controller to push the linked layers. And force, which determines the strength of the repel effect. Aside from these settings, we have delay and influence, which work identically to the field, so we won't cover them too in depth here. Okay, that's good for the target. Let's take a look at noise. The noise function is similar to the field, but rather than using proximity, it creates a simple random noise pattern. After we apply noise to layers, we can take a look at the controls on the noise controller. The first is strength. Strength here works similarly to the step, so it controls the influence of the noise. Enable noise toggles randomization on or off. We can evolve the noise pattern over time using the evolution control slider, and set the amount of turns before the noise loops with the noise period. We also have random seed. The delay settings can be used to offset the animation of the strength property. In other words, it works similarly to the target and step effector. Like the other effectors, it by default acts upon position. But we can link custom properties through the link button as we do with the other effectors. Three-dimension and two-dimension properties, like position and size, have a split dimensions property in their link effect. This determines whether the randomization of the noise applies uniformly over each dimension or not. On single value properties such as color or stroke width, we can choose whether we want the noise to be in sync with the X, Y, or Z randomization of other properties in this panel. Okay, that's good for the noise. Let's take a look at the inheritance. The inheritance function is very different from the other effectors. While the other effectors can work on their own, the inheritance effector only works if in the composition there exist MographAE cloner nulls. Inheritance allows you to morph layers to the position of a cloner. But how does it do this? Let's for instance take these Instagram posts. We can select all of these layers and then click the inheritance button to create an inheritance controller. At first, nothing will happen. If we check the inheritance controller, we can see that the MographAE inheritance effect has been added. Unlike the other controller effects in this script, the controls here are fairly sparse. We have access to only one parameter, the morph progress dial. Other than this, we have the ability to add a simple random delay. But what does morph progress do? If we increase it, nothing will happen right away. If we check below the inheritance controller effect, we'll see the morph target effects. These effects consist of a drop-down that allows us to select what kind of cloner controller we want the layers to morph to, a number to specify which cloner controller it is, and a checkbox that lets us know whether this is a valid cloner or not. Let's click the MographAE grid button to create a new MographAE grid controller. This will be grid number 1. Now that we've created a grid controller, our Morph Target 1 effect has the Valid Cloner checkbox on. This is because morph target 1 is set to be grid 1, which means it's going to attempt to morph the layers linked to the inheritance to MographAE grid number 1. And since we just created this controller in our composition, the layers are going to morph to it as we increase morph progress. Once morph progress is equal to 1 full turn, the layers will fully morph to MographAE grid 1. What if we want to morph our linked layers from this grid to another cloner controller? If we create a new controller such as array1, we can set the second morph target to be an array. Now, increasing the morph progress from turn 1 to turn 2, we morph from this grid to the array. What if we want to morph further after these two cloners to a new one, like a linear cloner? We can create a new controller using the linear button, then duplicate morph target 2 to create morph target 3 and set it to be linear. And now we can morph from morph progress turn 2 to turn 3 from the array controller to the linear controller. What if rather than morphing to another cloner, we want to return these layers' positions to their original state before they were linked to cloners? Let's duplicate morph target 3 to create morph target 4 and set it to return to default value. Now, when we morph from turn 3 to turn 4, we're going to return to the original position and rotation of the layers. So that's how inheritance works. As a note, if you want to reorder the sequence in which these morph targets come after each other, you don't have to go through and modify the dropdowns for each one. You can just shuffle the order of the morph target effects in the effects panel. The MographAE inheritance controller begins at the top of the effect stack, and then moves down to determine the next morph target. Okay, that's good for inheritance. Let's take a quick look at the helper effects. If you find that your composition gets too heavy, you can use the bake function instead. This will automatically convert all MographAE expressions to keyframes, and then delete the effects and controllers on the layers you selected. If you don't need to bake the whole animation but only a snapshot of the scene, you can use the clear function instead. The clear function works like the bake function, except rather than baking the whole animation, it only saves a snapshot of your current view. But what happens if you need to unlink a specific function, such as one field but leaving the other controllers on the layers linked? This is where the link and unlink function come in handy. In the previous tutorials, we already covered link to make it easier to link properties to the controllers, but let's recap. The link and unlink functions depend on the dropdown to the right of the link and unlink buttons. For instance, if I have a controller for a MographAE grid number 1 and MographAE grid number 2 in the composition, then this dropdown will list 1 and 2 as options next to the MographAE grid link button. If I select the layers and then click link with the dropdown set to 1, it'll link the layers to MographAE grid number 1. Alternatively, I have here MographAE grid number 2. I can open the dropdown and select 2 for the Mograph link button. And if I click link now, then these layers will instead link to MographAE grid number 2. So to recap, it works based on the dropdown, and you can link between different controllers based on the number that you specify. The unlink button works similarly to the clear function, but it works on specific controllers. It'll remove the link to the controller specified in the dropdown and save a snapshot of the value at the current time. For instance, let's create a field for these layers. I want to unlink this field while still keeping the layers linked to the grid. I can do this by selecting the layers, ensuring that I have one selected in the dropdown, and then click Unlink. Now the values will be baked for this frame, and I don't need the field anymore. So we can use this to selectively remove controllers while keeping others. So far, we didn't cover the organize function. The way it works is simple. It'll automatically recolor and then reshuffle the layers that you have selected in the timeline. Let's take these two grids for instance. They're supposed to be 3x2 grids, but something is obviously wrong. The layers aren't showing up in their proper positions. The reason is because somehow, while creating the project, the layers got improperly organized in the timeline. Rather than going through and manually reshuffling the layers, let's instead just click the Organize button. The grids are now looking properly. You'll notice that in the timeline, the script also auto-colored the layers and grouped them based on which controller they are linked to. This will help you stay clean, as the nature of the script can clutter your timeline. The select function actually has two alternative functions. The first function is that when you click a MoGraph controller like a grid and click select, you'll automatically select all of the linked layers to that controller. The second function is the select same properties function. In order to use it, you first select multiple layers, then find a couple properties or only one, and then run the script. Now you'll have the same property across all layers selected, and you can edit or do whatever you want to them.